You've always felt different. Not broken, not damaged, just misplaced. Like you were born with a different set of instructions than everyone else received. While others laughed at what felt empty, you noticed the silences, the shift in someone's tone, the loneliness behind their smile, the pain they tried to hide behind perfect social media posts. You saw the exhaustion in your mother's eyes when she said she was fine. You felt the sadness in your friend's voice when they said they were happy. You sensed the disconnect between what people said and what they truly felt. And when you tried to speak your truth, when you tried to address what you could see so clearly, they said, "You're too deep. You think too much. You feel too hard. You're making it more complicated than it needs to be. Can't you just be normal?" But what if your depth wasn't a flaw? What if it was a mirror, and they simply couldn't bear to look at their own reflection? What if the very thing that made you feel alien in this world was actually your greatest gift? What if your sensitivity wasn't weakness, but wisdom your soul was born knowing? What if your inability to accept surface-level explanations wasn't stubbornness, but an innate understanding that life is far more complex and meaningful than most people dare to acknowledge? Today, we're going to explore why you've always felt too deep for this world, and more importantly, why that's exactly as it should be. Why your sensitivity is not a curse to overcome, but a calling to embrace. Because maybe, just maybe, the world doesn't need you to be shallower. Maybe it needs you to stay exactly as deep as you are. Carl Jung once said, "A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them." And maybe that's what your sensitivity always was. Not weak, but the courage to feel what others fear. Not broken, but brave enough to stay open in a world that teaches us to close our hearts for protection. You didn't just observe life from a safe distance. You entered it fully. You felt every shadow, every nuance, every unspoken truth. You carried every question that others were too afraid to ask. And in return, you were often told to be simpler, lighter, quieter, less complicated, less intense, less you, but you weren't meant to live at the surface. Your soul was never built for shallow waters. Some souls come into this world as deep-sea explorers, while others are content to wade in the kiddie pool. Neither is wrong, but trying to force a deep-sea explorer to stay in shallow water is like asking an eagle to live in a cage. Jung understood this deeply. He knew that some souls come into this world wired differently, not to skim across life's surface like stones on water, but to dive deep into its mysteries, to explore the hidden currents, to feel the undercurrents others can't even sense, to swim in the depths where truth lives. He called these individuals the wounded healers, those who must first descend into their own depths, navigate their own darkness, and emerge with wisdom before they can guide others home to themselves. These are the souls who cannot turn away from pain, who cannot pretend everything is fine when it's not, who cannot live superficially because their very nature demands depth. If you've ever felt like you were born speaking a language this world doesn't understand, if you've ever wondered why everything seems to touch you so deeply, if you've ever felt like you're the only one who sees what you see, this is your story. This is your validation. This is your homecoming. So, you adapted, because that's what sensitive souls do. We learn to survive in a world that doesn't understand us. You silenced your questions that went too deep. You smiled when it didn't reach your eyes. You laughed when you wanted to leave. You nodded along with conversations that felt meaningless. You pretended to care about things that felt empty. You learned to speak the language of surface-level living. Because being accepted meant being edited. Being loved meant being smaller. Being included meant hiding the parts of you that made others uncomfortable. Jung called it the persona, the mask we wear to survive in society. It's not inherently bad. We all need personas to function. But the problem arises when the mask becomes so thick that we forget who we are underneath it. Behind that carefully constructed mask lived your real self. The one who saw everything, felt everything, questioned everything, and never stopped wondering why. The one who couldn't pretend that small talk was satisfying when your soul craved deep connection. The one who couldn't laugh at cruel jokes, even when everyone else did. The one who felt physically uncomfortable in environments that were emotionally dishonest. Let me tell you about Sarah. She discovered Jung's work at 25, after years of feeling like an emotional alien, walking among humans who seemed to speak a different language entirely. As a child, she'd cry at movies that barely moved others. She'd sense her mother's sadness before her mother even knew she was sad, picking up on micro-expressions and energy shifts that others missed completely. She felt the weight of the world in ways that made adults uncomfortable. When she learned about poverty, she couldn't sleep for weeks. When she saw a dead bird, she'd create elaborate funeral ceremonies. When her grandmother died, she grieved not just the loss, but the grief of everyone else who was trying to stay strong. Sarah's too sensitive, they'd say. She needs to toughen up. She can't go through life feeling everything so deeply. She'll never survive in the real world. So Sarah learned to perform. She became the easygoing friend, the one who never caused drama, never demanded too much emotional space, never brought up uncomfortable truths. She learned to laugh at jokes that hurt her soul. She stayed quiet when her intuition screamed warnings about people. She bit her tongue when she wanted to ask why everyone was pretending everything was okay, when it clearly wasn't. She developed what Jung would recognize as a false persona, not just a social mask, but a complete betrayal of her authentic nature. She became so good at being what others needed that she forgot who she actually was. But this is what Jung meant when he spoke of the shadow. All the parts of ourselves we push down, deny, or reject to be acceptable to others. Sarah's depth, her emotional intelligence, her psychic sensitivity, her ability to see what others couldn't. It all went into the shadow, hidden, denied, apologized for, treated as shameful secrets rather than sacred gifts. Your archetype was never made for performance. It was made for presence, for emotional truth, for depth of experience in a world addicted to distractions, surface-level interactions, and emotional numbing. Jung identified this as what I call the sensitive's dilemma. You possess what he called psychic sensitivity, an innate ability to perceive emotional undercurrents, unconscious motivations, energetic shifts, and spirituals, truths that others miss entirely. But this extraordinary gift comes with a painful price in a world that values efficiency over empathy, speed over depth, productivity over presence. You learned early that your natural way of being was too much for most people. Your need for meaningful conversation instead of small talk. Your tendency to ask the questions others avoided about death, meaning, purpose, truth. Your inability to engage in gossip when it felt like emotional violence. Your need to understand the why behind everything. Your inability to accept because that's how it's always been done as an adequate explanation. You noticed things others missed. The sadness behind someone's perfect smile. The fear behind someone's anger. The loneliness behind someone's busy schedule. You could feel when someone was lying, even when they were lying to themselves. You sensed when environments were emotionally toxic, even when they looked perfect on the surface. Think back to a moment in childhood when you were told you were too sensitive or too deep. What were you sensing that others couldn't see? What truth were you trying to express? How might your life have been different if that sensitivity had been honored instead of shamed? But how long can someone pretend to be shallow without drowning in their own silence? The answer came slowly, then all at once. You began to feel empty, disconnected, like you were living someone else's life while your real self withered in the shadows. You felt like a fraud, going through the motions of a life that didn't fit your soul. Jung warned about this very phenomenon. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But he also understood the cost. The cost of not becoming who you are is losing yourself entirely. And so began what Jung called the dark night of the soul, that period when the persona can no longer contain the truth of who you are, when the mask becomes so heavy that wearing it feels like suffocation, when the gap between who you are and who you're pretending to be becomes so wide that you feel like you're living a double life. This is the phase where many sensitive souls experience what looks like depression, anxiety, or a quarter-life or midlife crisis. But Jung would recognize it as something else entirely. The psyche's natural attempt to break free from false conditioning and return to authentic being. Your soul was calling you home, to yourself. And like all homecomings, it required leaving behind what no longer served you, even when that meant disappointing the people who preferred your edited version. Pause for a moment. Have you felt this disconnection from yourself? Have you experienced that moment when you realized you'd been hiding your true nature? Drop a word in the comments that describes how it felt when you first recognized the gap between who you were and who you were pretending to be. Then came the moment when the mask cracked and could no longer be repaired. You couldn't laugh at what hurt anymore. You couldn't stay in rooms that drained your soul. You couldn't keep pretending your needs were too much. You couldn't nod along with conversations that felt like spiritual violence. You couldn't smile and say, "Fine," when you were falling apart inside. The breaking point was different for everyone, but the result was the same. You could no longer live the lie. And so they called you difficult, cold, self-absorbed, dramatic, unstable, going through a phase, having a breakdown. But it wasn't selfishness, it was self-rescue. It wasn't a breakdown, it was a breakthrough. You didn't become too much. You just stopped being less than who you truly were. You stopped translating yourself into something palatable for others' comfort. You stopped shrinking your soul to fit inside someone else's narrow expectations. You stopped apologizing for having needs, feelings, and depths that others couldn't understand. You weren't falling apart, you were falling into yourself. You were remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. This is what Jung called the confrontation with the shadow, that moment when you can no longer deny the parts of yourself you've hidden, rejected, or pushed down. For the deeply sensitive, this confrontation often feels like a complete breakdown of identity, because so much of who you thought you were was actually just adaptation to others' expectations. Sarah described this period like this: "I felt like I was shedding my skin. Everything I thought I was, everything I'd been told I should be, suddenly felt like clothes that didn't fit. I couldn't wear them anymore, even though I didn't know what else to put on. I felt naked and terrified, but also free. For the first time in my life, I could breathe." The people around you didn't understand this transformation. They preferred the edited version, the one who didn't ask difficult questions, didn't feel so deeply, didn't need so much emotional honesty, didn't challenge their comfortable illusions. They wanted the you who made them feel better about their own choices to live superficially. When you started setting boundaries, they called it selfish. When you stopped pretending to enjoy things that drained you, they called it antisocial. When you began speaking your truth, they called it negative. When you started honoring your sensitivity, they called it weakness. Jung explained this phenomenon through his concept of psychological types. He identified that some individuals are naturally what he called introverted feelers, people whose primary function is to process life through deep emotional and value-based filters. These souls don't just experience emotions, they translate the entire world through feeling, meaning, and values. This is the psychological function that allows you to sense the emotional truth beneath surface interactions. It's like having an internal compass that always points toward authenticity. You can feel when someone is lying, not because you're psychic, but because their emotional energy doesn't match their words. You can sense when someone is in pain, even when they're hiding it perfectly. You can feel when environments are emotionally toxic, even when they look successful on the outside. But in a world that values what Jung called extroverted thinking, logic, efficiency, quick decisions, measurable results, the introverted feeler often feels fundamentally misunderstood and out of place. It's like being a poet in a room full of accountants or an artist in a factory. This is when you began to realize something revolutionary. Your depth wasn't a bug in your system, it was a feature. Your ability to feel deeply wasn't a weakness to overcome, but a strength to honor. Your sensitivity wasn't a disorder to be medicated, but a gift to be treasured. When you stopped apologizing for your sensitivity, something profound shifted. You began to see that the people who called you too much were often running from their own depths. Your presence reminded them of what they'd buried in themselves. Your authenticity highlighted their own masks. Your emotional honesty made their emotional numbness uncomfortable. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But he also knew the reverse was true. Everything that irritates others about you often reveals what they're unwilling to face in themselves. Your depth became a mirror, and not everyone was ready to look at their reflection. Your sensitivity became a challenge to their emotional numbness. Your questions became threats to their comfortable illusions. Your authenticity became an indictment of their performance. But this wasn't your problem to solve. This was your gift to honor. For one, weak, notice when someone criticizes your sensitivity or depth. Instead of taking it personally, ask yourself, what might this person be avoiding in themselves? What aspect of their own sensitivity or depth might they have buried? This was your initiation into what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, not who others need you to be. It's the journey from false self to true self, from persona to authenticity, from adaptation to integration. But individuation requires extraordinary courage. The courage to disappoint people who prefer your mask. The courage to be misunderstood by those who can't see beyond surface appearances. The courage to choose authenticity over acceptance. The courage to live your truth, even when it's lonely. And yes, it is lonely at first. Because when you stop performing the persona others are comfortable with, some people will leave. They'll say you've changed, become difficult, lost your way. But the truth is, you've found your way. You've just found a path. They're not ready to walk. Jung understood this loneliness intimately. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But the price is that you must often walk the path alone." And yes, it hurts deeply. Losing people who only loved the edited version of you feels like a special kind of grief. You mourn not just the relationships, but the illusion that they ever really knew you. You grieve the years you spent hiding your true self. You feel angry at yourself for shrinking, and angry at them for preferring you small. But staying would have meant losing yourself again. And you'd already tried that path. You knew where it led. So you began the slow, sacred work of unlearning the lie that to be lovable, you must first be easy to understand. That to be worthy of love, you must make yourself convenient for others. That your worth depends on how comfortable others feel in your presence. You learn to find peace in your own company. To honor your intuition, even when others questioned it. To trust your perceptions, even when others denied them. To stop apologizing for having a depth others couldn't swim in. This is what Jung called individuation, not the becoming of someone new, but the return to whom you've always been beneath all the masks, roles, and expectations. Let me share Michael's story in more detail. He was 32 when he finally stopped trying to be the person everyone expected him to be. He was a successful, corporate lawyer who'd built his entire life on being logical, unemotional, practical. His family was proud. His colleagues respected him. His bank account reflected his success. But inside, he was a poet, a mystic, someone who saw meaning in everything and felt called to explore life's deeper mysteries. He would write poetry in his office during lunch breaks and delete it before anyone could see. He would find himself staring out the window during meetings, wondering about the purpose of existence while others discussed quarterly profits. The breaking point came during a family dinner when his sister said, "Michael's going through some kind of midlife crisis. He's gotten all philosophical and weird. Yesterday he asked me what I thought the meaning of life was, over coffee. Who does that?" Everyone laughed. But that night, alone in his apartment, Michael realized he'd spent 32 years being ashamed of the very qualities that made him unique. His love of solitude, his need for meaning, his inability to care about things that felt shallow, his questions about existence, consciousness, and purpose. He'd been performing the role of successful lawyer so well that he'd forgotten who he was underneath the suit. But his soul had been calling to him through his poetry, his dreams, his sudden urges to quit everything and travel the world, his deep conversations with strangers that left him feeling more alive than any business deal ever had. Jung would have recognized Michael's journey as a return to his true self, that core essence that exists beneath all social conditioning and expectations. Jung distinguished between the ego, who we think we are based on external feedback and roles, and the self, who we truly are at our core. The self includes all aspects of our personality, light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, acceptable and unacceptable. Individuation is the process of integrating these aspects into a whole, authentic person. This integration requires what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites. Michael had to learn to hold both his practical, analytical side and his mystical, poetic side. His need for financial security and his desire for meaningful work. His love of solitude and his capacity for deep connection. His professional competence and his spiritual curiosity. For you, this integration might mean learning to hold both your sensitivity and your strength, your need for depth and your ability to function in a shallow world, your desire for solitude and your capacity for intimate connection, your emotional intensity and your rational mind. You discovered that being highly sensitive wasn't a disorder to be cured, but a temperament to be honored. Research by Dr. Elaine Aron shows that approximately 20% of the population has what she calls sensory processing sensitivity, the trait Jung would have recognized as natural psychic sensitivity. This isn't pathology, it's neurodiversity. Highly sensitive people process information more deeply, are more aware of subtleties in their environment, and are more emotionally reactive. Not because they're broken, but because their nervous systems are wired to perceive more. They notice things others miss, feel things others dismiss, and need time to process the overwhelming amount of information they're constantly receiving. You learn to reframe your traits through Jung's understanding. Your overthinking became deep processing, the mind's natural attempt to understand complexity. Your emotional intensity became emotional intelligence, the ability to navigate the subtle world of feelings. Your social exhaustion became the need for meaningful connection over superficial interaction. Your weird interests became spiritual curiosity, the soul's search for meaning. Your sensitivity to criticism became awareness of energy and intention. Your need for alone time became spiritual practice, time to integrate and process. Most importantly, you began to understand what Jung meant when he said, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." You stopped looking outside for validation of your worth. You stopped trying to convince others that your way of being had value. You stopped waiting for permission to be yourself. You simply started living it. Write a letter to your younger self, the one who was told they were too much. What would you tell them about their sensitivity? How would you help them see it as a gift rather than a burden? What wisdom would you share about navigating a world that doesn't always understand deep souls? This wasn't about becoming perfect or fearless. It was about becoming whole, about accepting all parts of yourself, the light and the shadow, the strength and the vulnerability, the confidence and the doubt. Jung taught that wholeness, not perfection, is the goal of human development. Jung taught that the goal isn't to eliminate suffering, but to find meaning in it. Your sensitivity had brought you pain, yes, but it had also brought you wisdom, empathy, and a depth of experience that many never access. Your wounds became your wisdom. Your depth became your gift to the world. The loneliness you felt wasn't just the absence of shallow connections. It was the presence of discernment. You were learning to distinguish between connections that fed your soul and interactions that drained it, between people who could meet you in your depth and those who needed you to stay on the surface. If you've started this journey of self-acceptance, if you've begun to honor your sensitivity as a gift rather than a burden, share one word that describes how it feels to stop apologizing for who you are. Let's create a community of deep souls who refuse to shrink. So, if you've always felt too deep for this world, if you've spent years wondering what was wrong with you, if you've been told to be less sensitive, less intense, less questioning, know this: you were never too much. You were just living fully in a world that has learned to numb itself to survive. And your depth? It's not a burden to carry. It's a beacon to follow. You are not here to fit in with those who live on the surface. You are here to feel fully, love honestly, question deeply, and exist unapologetically as exactly who you are. You don't need to be understood by everyone to be real. You don't need to make yourself smaller to be loved by the right people. You don't need to dim your light to make others comfortable in their darkness. Because the ones who are meant to walk with you, the ones who are meant to love you, the ones who are meant to journey alongside you, they won't fear your depth. They'll meet you in it. They'll recognize your sensitivity as strength, your questions as wisdom, your intensity as passion. Jung spent his life studying what he called the wounded healer, those who transform their deepest pain into their greatest gift, their greatest sensitivity into their greatest service. Your sensitivity, your depth, your inability to live on the surface. These aren't flaws to overcome. They're the very qualities the world needs most desperately right now. In a time when people are more disconnected than ever, despite being more connected through technology than any generation in history, your ability to feel deeply is medicine. In a world that's forgotten how to be authentic, drowning in curated perfection and filtered realities, your refusal to wear masks is revolutionary. In a culture that's addicted to shallow distractions, numbing entertainment, and surface-level interactions, your insistence on meaning and depth is necessary for our collective healing. You weren't born to be comfortable. Comfort was never your calling. You were born to be authentic, to dive deep, to ask the hard questions, to feel what others fear to feel. Deepness isn't an apology, it's freedom. It's the freedom to live according to your soul's truth, rather than society's expectations. Sarah, the woman I mentioned earlier, eventually found her way to becoming a therapist specializing in highly sensitive people. She helps other sensitive souls learn to honor their nature instead of hiding it. She's created a practice where depth is welcomed, where sensitivity is seen as a superpower, where the very traits she was once shamed for are now her greatest professional assets. Michael left his law practice and became a writer and workshop leader, crafting stories and creating spaces that help people connect with their inner depths. He leads retreats for men who feel too sensitive for traditional masculine expectations. His poetry, which he once hid in shame, now touches thousands of people who recognize their own hidden depths in his words. They didn't overcome their sensitivity, they transformed it into their purpose. They didn't learn to be less deep. They learned to swim confidently in their own depths and help others learn to swim in theirs. He believed that those who feel most deeply are often the ones called to heal not just themselves, but the collective wounds of humanity. Your sensitivity isn't a personal burden. It's a sacred responsibility. Your depth isn't a private struggle. It's a public service. The world needs people who can't pretend everything is fine when it isn't, who can't smile and nod when their soul is screaming that something is wrong, who can't participate in shallow conversations when deep truths are begging to be spoken, who can't live superficially when life itself is calling them to dive deep. You are the ones who remind the rest of us what it means to be truly human. Not perfectly human, but authentically human. Not comfortably human, but courageously human. So stop apologizing for your depth. Stop making yourself smaller to make others comfortable. Stop translating your truth into something more palatable for those who fear their own intensity. The right people will understand your language without translation. The right relationships will honor your depth without asking you to shallow it. The right life will feel authentic, not performed. Jung's final message to those who feel too deep for this world was beautifully simple. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who your family wants you to be, not who society expects you to be, not who your friends are comfortable with you being, but who you truly are at your core. You have that privilege, you have that power, you have that sacred responsibility, not to live according to the world's version of who you should be, but to live according to your soul's truth of who you are. Your depth is not your weakness, it's your superpower. Your sensitivity is not your shame, it's your strength. Your inability to live on the surface isn't a flaw in your design. It's your freedom, your calling, your gift to a world that has forgotten how to feel. The world doesn't need you to be shallower. It needs you to stay as deep as you are and show others that it's safe to dive beneath the surface of their own lives. If this message echoes something deep inside you, if you recognize yourself in this story, if you're ready to stop apologizing for your depth and start celebrating it, leave a comment. I choose depth over acceptance. Let's create a community of souls who refuse to live small, who choose authenticity over approval, who honor their sensitivity as the gift it truly is. Because your soul is not a mistake, it's your message to the world. Until next time, the world has been waiting for you to finally, fully, courageously deliver it.